Welcome to another episode of PG Radio. Before we begin this episode, as I've established sort of a tradition to offer some background on the many wanderings to sort of lay the subtext and the context to the conversation, I'm going to continue doing that. And I think today's introduction is going to be two parts. And the first part is going to be housekeeping, and housekeeping is for people who regularly or often, or who follow me enough to care about me. And the second part is for everybody. So if you were a listener who's come here for the first time, who does not really care about PG Radio, who does not really care about Prakhar, you want to forward this to this timestamp. For everybody else, I have felt that now that I've gotten a little more free, now that I have a little more room to breathe since my semester is over, that I would like to put in more effort in the conversations that I'm making. For a very long while, I've been making conversations that I like, but I want to get you to be a part of this process as well. I want to understand the kind of conversations people who listen to me regularly, if you're people who follow PG Radio, I want to ask you what you expect from PG Radio. I want to include you to be a part of the process more directly. And therefore, I want to have a conversation with all of you. I will fix up either a call or we'll chat. I want you to find me on my Instagram and DM me. I'll have my Instagram link put up right here. Find me on my Instagram, DM me with, that'll be put right here too. So all of that will work out. That'll be, all the details will be on the screen. But the general idea is, please reach out to me. I want to get some feedback from you. I want to understand how I can serve you better. I want to include you in the process of the feedback. I want to understand how I can make my conversations more effective for you and where we can go with PG Radio further. I want you to be included in this process. So that is that for housekeeping. I'm definitely going to enjoy having more time to put into PG Radio as a project. I think of all the things that I do, this is something I enjoy the most. And I've been having phenomenal conversations. I've been learning so much that I've almost not cared enough to see if people who follow me regularly have been learning as much. So I want to make sure I know where I'm getting far too complex. I want to know where I'm getting far too simple. I want to know where I'm getting too distracted. I want to get that feedback. I want to understand what this experience means to you, because I want to continue serving you in the best possible way. Right. The second part, which is the introduction to this podcast. Today's podcast, the episode that you're going to see, is with a gentleman by the name of Herbert Terrace. And Herbert Terrace is one of the most prominent figures in the field of the evolution of language, animal communication, and psycholinguistics in general. Herbert Terrace has been invested in the field for about close to half a decade now. And he's famous for his experiments with a chimp in trying to teach him language, and then finally arriving at the final word in the field up until he arrived at the conclusion in the field of animal language to say that actually chimps, our smartest, closest ancestors, cannot really learn language. I took a semester in the evolution of language with Professor Terrace not too long ago, and I was stunned by the number of absolutely brilliant stories that are hidden within this domain that just don't get out. Like purely as stories, they are some of the best stories I've heard. And one of the stories is pretty much the thesis of this field, which is, how did language, the biggest differentiator between chimpanzees and humans, between the closest ancestors we've had and us, how did bloody language evolve, and how did it get so complicated? And this question has almost biblical importance. Like when Darwin came out with the theory of natural selection, he did it with a gentleman by the name of Alfred Wallace. Alfred Wallace was a naturalist. Like he was invested in plants more than animals, and so he was coming from the plant area where he was like, I've discovered theory of natural selection, and Darwin was coming from the animal area, and he's like, I've discovered the theory of natural selection. They meet, they shake hands, they present their paper, and they're world famous, until Wallace wakes up one day and he's like, wait, that doesn't make sense. And he says, hey, listen, Darwin, if really the theory of natural selection is working, then we need to be only tiny bit smarter than chimpanzees. Why is it that the stupidest human is so much smarter than the smartest animal? And so he backed out. So within the very story of evolution, the question of the evolution of language is embedded. And Professor Terrace has done tremendous work, fantastic progress in answering that question. And that is only one of the interesting stories. The second interesting story within Professor Terrace's field of study is the story of how the academic field of animal language came to be. That story is very interesting by itself, because for a long time we believed that there were certain chimps and there were certain apes that could speak language, until Professor Terrace conducted his famous experiment with the chimp Nim Chimpsky. And that is when he and the entire field almost reticently came to a conclusion. Well, it looks like only we can really use language. And it's not as simple. Like it's not as simple. What does language really mean emerges at this point, and what is language really made of, and how do we understand the difference between animal communication and human language? And all these questions are built into the story. The third of the most interesting stories is, how is it that human babies learn language? language. And I think that is such a fantastic story. Like, I think the role of the parent, and since humans are alloparent species, as we'll discover with the conversation with Professor Terrace, the caregiver to the child is so important for the child to learn language, to socialize with the world, to understand reality, that it is almost poetic that nature would embed such an important process within such an important process. The conversation in general, Professor Terrace was an attempt to explore the question: how did language evolve? Why is it important? What is happening with language? And then ask him if there are some other strange relationships that language has, like for instance with music. Professor Terrace was kind enough to give me a second round at recording a podcast with him. The first time we did it, we did not really manage the logistics right. It was just around the time that the corona flip was happening and we were no longer doing live interviews and we'd moved on to online stuff. So I hope you find this interview interesting. I hope you find this conversation really at least to me, it's one of the most this is the class that turned me to evolutionary psychology. I was like, hell yeah, let's go do evolutionary psychology. Yeah. Thank you so much for watching. Let's see you after the episode. Oh, by the way, I mean, I hate to say this. It's not really in my nature, but if you're watching this, please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and whatnot. At least subscribe. Like, I've been working really hard. This is episode 70 something. And if you check the number of subscribers I have down below, it's not really a lot. And part of it is because I never really make an effort to say it. So if you're watching it, please subscribe to my channel. You'd find some really interesting conversations happening down here. Thank you so much. And I'll see you on the other side of the show. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Terrace, for doing this again. We sort of ended up, how do you say, at least I, on my end, I did not care about the production quality of our first episode.
Well, as I said, it was my first attempt on Zoom after teaching, and I was in a very cramped situation, and I just didn't feel comfortable.
Yeah, I can totally understand. And I mean, I'm sure just adapting to Zoom in terms of delivering the depth of academic and all that stuff hasn't been easy. Like, to interface with the screen after all those years of speaking to students directly hasn't been easy.
Oh, no.
What are your end of semester
I don't look forward to it in the fall. I have a feeling teaching is going to be online in the fall.
Right.
And in Zoom. I actually had an invitation from some colleagues in China to teach. Mm-hmm. And they are using a different software I never heard of called Classin, Classin. Have you ever heard of that?
No, not at all.
They claim it's better.
So. But I guess you better get used to that, because, you know, like the speed at which R&D is happening in that particular domain of technology,
like amazing.
Rooms, it is just mind-blowing, right? Absolutely. So are you saying that next semester might be both online and offline?
Yes.
And is that like...
No, it's not, they haven't made a decision.
It's a soft call.
It's going to be decided by the end of the month, because, you know, students have to know.
Right.
But it may be that they'll just have freshmen and sophomores on campus so they can make friends, and upper class, you know, online. I don't know what they're going to do.
Right. Okay. I'm also very curious, as a professor who's been in the business of teaching for so long. What are your end of semester notes on adapting to this online format of teaching? Do you think it's sustainable? Did you have as much fun with the student?
I hope it's over within a semester. The main problem is, when I teach, I like to get feedback by looking at students' faces, and I can't do that online. So it's as if I'm lecturing blind.
Right.
And especially if you have a large class, then you don't have any interaction. They can, you know, raise their hand or hit, you know, chat some things, but it's not the same as if it's, you know, really live.
Right. And isn't that right? Please finish.
That's what
I said. Isn't that like when you said that the feedback is so important, that my facial expressions, when you talk to me, my body language, my micro reactions are so important to make sense of what you are saying for yourself. That is sort of what is super unique about the field of study that you do as well, is human communication, right? Like it is bidirectional by nature.
Bidirectional by nature, right?
Right. So because when I'm recording all my videos, I do podcasts and I have a YouTube channel where I'm just speaking to the camera. Part of the process is me having to imagine somebody who I'm speaking to when I'm speaking to the camera,
Yeah.
like this person who I'm explaining this to. And part of my creative process is designing this person and then imagining his reactions to what I'm saying and then delivering what I'm delivering. So I think yes, please.
There's an interesting lesson here. You see, if I were a politician or if I was on the stage, I would rehearse everything I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And in that rehearsal process, I would anticipate, the audience reaction. But to do it spontaneously, as you do in a lecture, all of these lectures are spontaneous. It's a totally different experience.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you can rehearse it
Right.
as an actor does, on stage, then the audience reaction is not that important. But if you can't rehearse it, that's another story.
I also wonder because I think it's been 3 semesters since I took the one class with you, and I mean that class opened up my mind to evolutionary thinking in a way that almost nothing has. And part of the reason why I did that was because the format of your class, which was a discussion group instead of a lecture, right, allowed me to almost encourage me to be like, okay, you know what, take a shot, see what the professors think, see what the expert think, right? And I don't know if that is recreatable easily.
You can't do that online. No.
Right? So like the proper encouragement to think,
that's right,
cannot sort of be, right? It's not obvious how that will happen online.
Right. It's sort of free, why not?
Right, right. I'm also interested as to what you're doing now that the semester is over.
What I'm doing now?
Yes, are you, because we were talking about how you're, planning on writing another book.
I'm planning to write another book. I'm planning for lectures I'll give next spring. Yeah, but I'm mainly reading and writing. That's what the summer is for.
Right, right. And I'm assuming what you're reading and writing has to do exactly with, what you teach, which is the evolution of language.
That's right.
Right. So my question to you is this: why must I, or anybody else for that matter, what's so interesting about the evolution of language? Why should I care?
Well, what's not obvious about the evolution of language is that language is the only phenomenon that evolution has yet to explain. It's sort of like an Achilles heel. All attempts at explaining language, the evolution of language, have failed. And I can now, with the wisdom of hindsight, tell you why that's the case. But when I got into the business, I just assumed language was a simple thing. It didn't have to be broken down into different levels, as I now think it has to be. And I thought, well, why not study language in a non-human creature like a chimpanzee?
Right, right. So it's because this problem with not being able to define how language might have evolved is almost as old as Darwin himself, right? Darwin comes out with the theory of natural selection. He does
Except that Darwin only spoke about language, as if it was a thing.
Right.
As if it was, say, eye color.
Uh-huh.
As if it was your height.
As if it was just one characteristic.
As one characteristic, right.
Right.
And
right.
I think everybody from Chomsky to other linguists and so on always spoke about language as one thing. It turns out it's really many things. And each of those things had to evolve separately, I believe.
So in that sense, would you say that language is like an epiphenomena born out of many phenomena? Does that fit the category?
It's a multiple phenomenon. It's generated by many simpler characteristics.
Right, right. And I want to ask you what those characteristics are. But just to put a nail as to how important this question has been, I remember you telling us about how Alfred Wallace distanced himself from Darwin's theory of natural selection. They were the co-presenters of the theory, but Wallace had a doubt, and Wallace says, listen, I think your job's fine enough, but you cannot explain why there is such a huge difference between the lowest of humans and the highest of animals.
That's what Wallace said.
Right.
First agreed with Darwin, and then 10 years later, he said, from the point of view of natural selection, humans should only be a smaller amount more intelligence than a chimpanzee.
Right.
They wouldn't have language, they wouldn't have music, they wouldn't have culture, all these other things. So we couldn't understand why we were so much more intelligent. And I think his problem, as I hope to make clear, is that he also did not differentiate language into its components. If he simply asked, say, well, how did words evolve and not the rest of language, the problem would be much easier. But like everybody else, from Darwin down to Chomsky, language was just one thing.
So, you know, I think there is no point carrying this conversation on without addressing what makes the composite of language. What are these parts? Because I do not know myself.
Okay. I would say that at least 4 things had to occur before we get to language as we know it. The first is not obvious. Chimpanzees, our closest living ancestors, are mainly competitive and minimally cooperative. So the first had to be a switch from competing to cooperating.
Right.
And unless you cooperate, you can't have language. Okay. Then there had to be at least 2 stages that are nonverbal before words are produced by an infant. The first of those stages is an emotional bond between the infant and the mother. And this occurs during the first 6 months. And it occurs because of a evolutionary quirk. Human infants are the most helpless primate when they're born. Their brains are only 25% of their adult volume. The chimpanzee's brain is about 50%. And similarly, the skeletal nervous system of an infant is so underdeveloped that they can't even crawl or walk until they're about 6 months old. That means that they have to be cradled. Now, one of the wonders of evolution is how that act of cradling actually facilitated the development of language. Because when an infant is cradled, she's held about 7 inches from the mother's eyes. And that allows the mother and the infant to share gaze and interact.
Pass on information.
And interact emotionally. So that's the first step. It also turns out that infants are exquisitely sensitive to faces, particularly their eyes and their mouth. So because of cradling, which is a byproduct of our becoming bipedal, which I won't go into now,
Yes,
and,
that's a story
and
by
only humans are bipedal, possibly some of our ancestors, but not chimpanzees. Infants are cradled, and that leads to this emotional bond between the mother and the infant. Then when the infant is about 6 months old, she does begin to crawl and walk and become interested in external objects. See, at first it's just a dyad between the mother and the infant. But that relation changes to a triadic relation between the mother, the infant, and an external object. So the infant can point to an external object, can pick it up, can show it to the mother, and they engage in what's called joint attention, where not only is the infant emotionally bonded to the mother in a dyadic sense, but now they share attention to external objects. That's also uniquely human. That had to evolve separately.
The act of pointing.
The act of pointing and the act of sharing attention to an external object.
Right.
And then, and only then, can the mother say, well, that's a flower, that's a glass, that's a toy, and the infant, in sharing attention to the object, can say, yes, that is a flower, that is a toy, and so on. That's how you get the first word. So all of those steps, from competition to cooperation,
Cradling.
through cradling and into subjectivity to joint
Right.
attention, were necessary before the first words were produced.
Right.
And so when you ask, how did language evolve? You have to be prepared to say how all of those other steps evolved. That tremendously simplifies the problem.
So just to try and understand, and I think, I mean, even though I did understand these components from having read a lot of your work and having sat in a lecture with you, but this is the first time they've been presented to me like this. So let me just try and walk through them. The first one that you said is that as soon as competition, the pressure of competition changes to a pressure of cooperation, now there is a need to interact, and therefore language has a possibility of emerging, right? So like, this is us thinking in survival pressure kind of a thing. The second thing that we're talking about is the fact that the human baby is helpless, and therefore it needs to be put near another adult, and through proxy, by the proxy of that, there is information being passed on in some sense,
Right.
which is in some sense through eye contact and stuff. And
Right.
then the third step is the first contact, the first interaction that I'm having with my mother is us sharing an emotional state, sort of by looking into each other's eyes, or at least, you know, whatever version of that. And the fourth is then when my mother starts pointing to or referring to things or attending to things, and I look at the same thing she is looking at.
And
this
sharing
is where,
attention.
right, this is sharing attention then. Right. So those are the four simplified steps as to four things that we need to explain before we begin to opine upon the evolution of language.
Right.
Right. So like you said, you've had the privilege of hindsight. You can look back and through developmental psychology and whatnot make sense of this. But back in the day, this was a highly contested issue, right? Like it
wasn't even contested. It wasn't even realized. In other words, when I started working with a chimpanzee in the early 70s, and actually some other colleagues started in the 60s, everybody just thought it was just language. You know.
Right.
And they also were highly influenced by Chomsky, who said the real challenge is to get a non-human primate to produce a sentence. He took for granted that they can have words, which in fact they can't have. But can those words be combined to produce a sentence? So most people who were doing this research were intent on demonstrating grammatical ability in a chimpanzee.
Right. And so I think in the story of how this entire thing goes, the evolution of language and the academic attempt of finding the answers to the question, as well as what really gave birth to the evolution of what really caused evolution of language, the Skinner-Chomsky conversation is very important to be put in place, right? So that so that we understand as to what the components of language are, what was the commentary that was happening around then. And this is the early 50s, I'm assuming. Skinner
wrote a book in 1957. He called it Verbal Behavior. And in that book, he said language could be explained by simple conditioning. And it was Chomsky's critique of that book that really brought him into world of fame.
Right.
And he said it's impossible to explain language by conditioning. And in hindsight, I think he was only half right. He said it couldn't explain words, but that's a different argument for why it couldn't explain sentences. I think Chomsky's criticism of Skinner with regard to sentences was absolutely correct, and that's what started his career of searching for universal grammar, showing that behaviorism and conditioning could not explain sequences of words. But in fact, Chomsky is famous not only for universal grammar, but he's also famous for arguing that the function of language is to help us think and not to communicate. He thinks that communication is secondary, and there he was wrong. And I think Skinner was very prescient in arguing his definition of verbal behavior. He said verbal behavior is behavior that has to be reinforced through another person. So instead of saying, instead of just grabbing for an apple, you say, please pass the apple, and somebody else has to pass the apple.
Right.
And that introduces the distinction between a speaker and a listener, and the conversational aspect of language, where both can be either the speaker or the listener. And I think that's something that Chomsky completely missed. I certainly missed it when I was doing the Chimp project, and only later realized it in hindsight.
So I clearly see that there is a distinction between words and grammar as far as understanding the concept of language is concerned. And I'm only curious, this is speculative. So, I mean, I don't expect you to know. Maybe you do. It's a speculative thought that I had in my head. Is it possible that this pressure to think is the pressure that resulted in a universal grammar, and the words came from the fact that we needed a bidirectional communication? So for instance, I evolved the word glass, but I could not say, please pass me the glass, because there was no pressure to think clearly until later. Is that possible?
No, I don't think so, because the question is, where does that word come from? Words are totally different from any form of animal communication. Animal communication is mainly emotional signals. Keep out of my territory. I want to mate with you. I'm angry at you, and so on. And it's unidirectional. Animal communication is simply to influence the behavior of another organism. It's not to communicate information. Words make this huge evolutionary jump to communicate information. And the first question somebody interested in the evolution of language has to explain is, where did words come from? Actually, there are prior questions, but let's just keep it simple now.
Right.
You see, Chomsky took words for granted, and I think all linguists took words for granted at that time. And as I said, thought the challenge was grammar and syntax. But the real problem is, where did words come from?
And so where did words come from? What do we know?
Well, when I realized that my chimpanzee wasn't learning language, I really scratched my head and couldn't understand why such an intelligent creature as a chimpanzee couldn't learn language. And over the years, since I terminated that project, I was impressed by two totally separate lines of research. One from paleoanthropology. These were anthropologists, paleologists who discovered that between chimpanzees and humans, there were many other species that evolved. In fact, since that time, they discovered at least 24 species after chimpanzees, before Homo sapiens appeared. And then developmental psychologists discovered these nonverbal stages during the infant's first year that precedes language. And slowly but surely, I realized that a chimpanzee is the wrong species to compare to humans. You have to pick a more recent ancestor. Unfortunately, they're not alive, but they're nevertheless real. And you have to look at the nonverbal antecedents of language before you get the first words. So realizing the significance of that research totally changed my whole view as to why it's a total mistake to try to teach language to a chimpanzee.
That is so interesting. I have two questions here. One of them, I'm curious because I've seen a lot of evolutionary biologists. I've seen a lot of evolutionary psychologists, especially the psychologists and biologists who are interested in writing about polygamy and who are interested in writing about, um, more naturalistic behavior, will very often use chimpanzees as a viable metric to sort of, so the chimpanzees do this, and, polygamy is a part of their thing. And how safe are we when we are comparing chimpanzees with humans in terms of evolutionary behavior?
Well, there are two schools of thought. One school says, well, look, their genome is 98% similar to humans. And what's more, they're the only living ancestors, so why not look to chimpanzees? But on the other hand, you can say that 2% difference
Is all that matters.
accounts for so many other things, not only language. We're bipedal, we have larger brains.
We are cooperative.
We're cooperative. So take the thing about cooperation. With chimpanzees, you typically have a dominance hierarchy. And it's the alpha male who gets the first crack at food. So if it's been demonstrated by a psychologist named Tomasello, who studied both chimpanzees and children. So he did a lot of research on chimpanzees. He arranged a situation where in one room you have a dominant chimp and in another room you have a subordinate chimp, and in between you put some food. And they both can see this. And if the subordinate chimp sees the dominant chimp have access to the food, it won't even try to get the food. However, if you put a barrier in front of the entrance to the dominant chimp's room so that the dominant chimp cannot see the food, then the subordinate will go out and grab the food. So whenever there's food, there's tremendous competition. Now, there's now evidence from paleoanthropology that our ancestors, such as Homo erectus, who evolved about 2 million years ago, shared food. That the whole dominance issue was replaced by cooperation.
Fantastic.
And
2 million years ago.
2 million years ago. So given that they were sharing food, that's prima facie evidence that they were cooperating, that one individual didn't hog the food at the expense of others. And then there's the question of, so where did that cooperation come from? And that's another story. There's a anthropologist named Artie who says it has to do with cooperative breeding, that Homo erectus was not only raised by the mother, but by many other parents, alloparents, who also shared.
Is this the bonobo model?
Is this what?
The bonobo model of bonobos raise their children?
No,
like
not bonobos. This is, it's called, if you have cooperative breeding, your mother does provide the main protection and access, but so does the grandmother, so do brothers and sisters, even the father can partake in rearing the young. So her insight is that the infant not only has to form an emotional connection with the mother, but with all these other alloparents. And her point is that because of satisfying these other alloparents, there's selection for that infant to be cooperative. That those infants who can satisfy many alloparents have a greater chance of survival than those who don't.
Right.
And that's her argument as to where cooperation came from.
Interesting. It is also so interesting to me that paleoanthropology has so much to say about evolutionary biology and psychology in some sense. And
that's only in the last 30 or 40 years.
Right. So I'm curious, when you said that there is about 24 species between chimpanzees and humans in some sense, right? And that the best possible metric to understand what is happening to us in terms of evolution would be a dead ancestor, right?
Yes.
And I'm assuming paleoanthropology has figured that there were all these species through fossils. So I'm curious if there is like, is that the evidence, if I'm say testing for, was joint attention or intersubjectivity present in my last cousin?
Well,
Are we doing morphological?
Yeah. The evidence from paleoanthropology points to Homo erectus, this second, ancestor that was like humans. First, there was Homo habilis,
Mhm.
and then 500,000 years later, Homo erectus appeared.
Hmm.
Homo erectus, by the way, seemed to be around until maybe 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. So they were around for almost
A very long time.
for more than 1.5 million years. And they were the first ancestor who left Africa. Then a few 100,000 years, they went to the Middle East, they went to Southeast Asia, and to Java. So they had to have some way of communicating to keep their groups coherent. But the most interesting fact is that they seemed to scavenge animals. They weren't able to hunt animals, but they were able to find a dead animal and organize other Homo erectus to come help them scavenge, that is, to butcher the animal to get meat. And in answer to Wallace's question, it's clear that they needed meat because their brains were so much larger than a chimpanzee's, and meat is the most efficient way of getting the protein
Energy, right?
To sustain these large brains. So there was clearly survival value in scavenging. And in scavenging, by the way, Homo erectus were much taller and really bipedal. They were almost like marathon runners. They could cover a tremendous area of East Africa. So imagine one Homo erectus who discovers a dead zebra, say killed by a lion, and or a saber-toothed tiger, or whatever other carnivores were around at the time. The Homo erectus had to go back to his group and say, I just discovered a dead zebra or a dead elephant, and I need your help in scaring away other animals who might be interested in scavenging and in butchering that animal. Homo erectus was able to use stone tools with sharp edges to cut through the hides of these animals. So, but they couldn't do it alone. They needed help. And one theory is that after discovering a dead animal, Homo erectus had to communicate to other members of his group that I found a dead animal, but that dead animal couldn't be seen. It was miles away. So the question is, how do you describe an object that they can't see? And that requires what linguists refer to as displacement. They have to get the other Homo erectus to think about an object they could not see. And that's the linguist who's responsible for that theory argues that's where words came from. By getting somebody to think about something they can't see. And I think that's the best explanation for where the words originally came from.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, when we talk about evolutionary hypotheses, we speak about the logical strands, which are made up of survival pressures, right? So you tell me that the displaced reference to an object in the distance is a pressure, and that might have led to the evolution of words and all of that. I am curious if there is, because we do have fossils. We know that the Homo erectus were standing up and bipedal, and they were crossing all these places. And obviously, if they have to get to Java, if they have to cross the sea, first of all, how did that happen? They need some cooperative element. They need to be able to communicate. They need to get on the same floating boat or whatever that is. I'm just curious if we have any idea what were the survival pressures that were causing Homo erectus to evolve in the first place as well. Like, what was happening? Do we have any idea?
Yes, we know that the environment, the climate changed radically at that time. The environment was much cooler, so forests became thinner. There was much more open grassland, and that was key in the evolution of many large hoofed animals, zebra, wildebeest, and so on. So one, Homo erectus didn't have the jungle or the forest to fall back on. Two, they had a need to find meat. And three, they had all these new species or multiples of older species to feed upon. So it was these pressures that contributed ultimately to their scavenging.
I have heard something about the throwing hypothesis, the fact that, you know, the best way we could hunt was by throwing something, because we have these shoulders from hanging, but one throw is not going to do, so we need to be collective. And because we have to be
let me stop you right there, because one question is, what are you going to throw?
Right.
And spears weren't invented at that time.
Right. Rocks?
Well, but the second question is, it takes a lot of practice to aim and to really hit your target. So there's no evidence that Homo erectus had that ability. What they did have was the ability to make simple stone tools that had sharp edges, could cut, you know, the hide of an animal.
Right.
But the use of spears, evidence that people use spears didn't occur until hundreds of thousands of years later. Homo erectus may eventually have used spears, but we're talking about when they first evolved.
That is, it is so interesting to me that the disagreements within the evolutionary sphere of things are about like such intuitive questions. You're like, but what were they throwing? And somebody's written a book about the throwing hypotheses. Like I really like the fact that it's first principle thinking in that sense.
Well, it's even more than that, because there's now evidence that within the last million years, Homo erectus used fire, which they also helped them cook. And it's much easier to process meat that's cooked than to eat it raw.
Right.
But initially they didn't have fire. So we're saying that not only couldn't they throw things or have the aim to throw things or have the weapons to hunt, but they didn't even have fire. All those things had to be, but now there's evidence as to when those things actually did occur.
Right. Would you say the true hero of the human line of evolution is Homo erectus? Like those were the ones that were really innovating in that direction, or?
Homo erectus seems to be the best candidate. You can't prove it.
Right, of course.
But you can, there's circumstance, well, there is this evidence. You see, we do have fossils of animals who were hunted and scavenged. And we could look at the bones of those animals. And what paleoanthropologists have done is looked microscopically at these bones for what are called bite marks. These are the marks from a lion or a leopard or a tiger. And also cut marks. These are the marks made by a stone tool. And what they've shown is that in many cases, the cut marks are below the bite marks, meaning that Homo erectus got there first, and that only afterwards did other animals pull the rest of the meat off.
That changes everything.
So that is evidence that they scavenged. And then if you have evidence that they scavenged, you have to ask, well, there had to be some organization to that scavenging. Right. And when Homo erectus had to communicate to other Homo erectus, what and where the animal was that had to be scavenged. So that's the argument for the origin of language. There's no question that they scavenged.
Right.
Then the question is how they communicated about scavenging. That's the conjectural part.
Right. I'm curious, and this might be a little off tangent too. It's just a little thought I had. So, as far as I'm aware, the field of evolutionary psychology was originally called sociobiology, and then it acquired a more formalized way of thinking, and they started calling it evolutionary psychology. And from there, the way it has moved forward is that it's beginning to incorporate fields like molecular genetics, it's paleoanthropology, in your case, linguistics, and I'm sure you've seen all that happen while you've been in an academic career. I'm wondering if you have a guess as to what will be the breaking point in the future of evolutionary study when we'll be able to answer these questions with more certainties than stories that are based upon first principle logic.
Well, it's going to be a very slow process because, you know, discovering fossils is a tough business.
Right.
I mean, when you talk about the tip of the iceberg, you're
Right.
very rarely do you discover a complete skeleton when you discover a fossil. Paleoanthropologists are happy when they find a tooth, let alone a complete skull, let alone a complete body.
Right.
So, but slowly but surely, more and more fossils will be discovered. And that will provide more and more evidence of the type of creatures that evolved, and specifically in the case of scavenging, how dead animals that also have to be discovered, you know, through fossils, were scavenged and shared by our ancestors. There's also, only going back to Neanderthal, Homo Neanderthal, now evidence of the genome of Neanderthals. Whether biologists will be able to discover the genome of Homo erectus, that would be possibly another breakthrough. But,
Right.
you know, these things will take time, but the growth of research in this area is accelerating. So it's hard to predict when these things are going to happen.
Would it still not be so? Say if we do discover all these fossils, the study would still be very morphological, right? We still would not be able to, have like an in-depth pool of information.
Well, you won't be able to unless you've developed a time machine,
right? Right.
And listen to what Homo erectus said at the beginning of words.
Right. Or Jurassic Park, something like a Jurassic Park where you recreated that species. Yeah.
No, but we still don't know actually how the universe was born, and yet astronomers speculate, and the speculations get better and better as to how that happened. So by piling one circumstantial bit of evidence on top of another, we rule out bad arguments and we find the good arguments.
It's interesting that you mention astronomers because, physicists, especially involved in, matters of extremely big objects, astronomy and all that jazz, they usually, they talk about a sense of awe that they acquire from finding out how absolutely miserably little we know about this entire field. Does that happen to you? We have no answers. How amazing is this? Does that ever happen to you in your academic career? Something like that?
It happens all the time. I mean, I think that one way of putting it, there was a very famous biologist, Stephen Gould, who argued that, if in fact God rolled the dice again and different quirks of evolution did happen, Homo sapiens would never have evolved.
Really so far.
It was a consequence of an incredible string of happenstance reactions. There was no purpose involved. It just happened that way. And the chances of it happening again are less than 1 in a trillion. And what the challenge is now to figure out what all those little challenges and circumstances were.
Right. Wasn't Stephen Jay Gould a paleoanthropologist?
He was a biologist.
He was a biologist, right? Yeah. Right. It's so interesting that to even make a statement like that, you involve physics, right? It's chaos theory. If you change the initial conditions, even the slightest, what happens eventually is anybody's business. We have no idea. It'll be so different, right? I'm also, a part of the fascination that I had with your class was really understanding the story of how animal communication was researched upon and how it was concluded, because it's not the most conventional story in an academic discipline. It's not like, oh, we figured it out. There was a certain climax that involved you, right? And I want to ask you about that part. You were trying to train Nim Chimpsky into being able to speak a language, and then eventually you realized that's not going to happen. What happened there? What was the story?
Well, that has to be broken down into a number of parts. When I was in graduate school, psychologists were still absorbing the research done by von Frisch on language in bees. And very little was known about animal communication and its limits. Mm-hmm. As we learn more and more about animal communication, we know that bees, for example, can signal to other bees where there's food very precisely. They can signal where food is 2-3 miles away. They do it in terms of their position and the position of the sun and directing bees to go in that direction. But it turns out that all of that is hardwired. There's no learning involved.
You don't acquire it.
You don't acquire it. It's hardwired. And what's more, those bees can't change their message to say, oh, instead of doing this dance about where the food is, I'll sing or I'll do something else. That's also, that can't be changed. It's immutable. And then later on, the psychologists discovered vervet monkeys can signal that a particular kind of predator is around. Like if there's an eagle, you make one sound, and that compels the other vervet monkeys to hide in trees. Or if there's a snake, to look on the ground and make sure that you're not open to attack by a snake. Or if there's a leopard, you engage in other kinds of action to avoid being eaten up. Now, these were very distinct signals. But here again, it turns out these are hardwired. They can't change their tune. So over the last 100 years, psychologists discovered there are many different kinds of signals that animals use to communicate. But no animal has more than a dozen or 24 at most of these signals. Some of them are chemical, some of them are vocal, some of them are engaging in the whole body and so on. But they're all for emotional communication. And there was very little thought about what the difference is between that kind of communication and language. And I think one of the nice byproducts of trying to teach a chimpanzee language was, on the one hand, to see the difference between that and animal communication. And on the other hand, to realize the limitation of the few instances of communication that a chimpanzee can acquire. And in a word, those were all what linguists refer to as imperative. Chimps are smart enough to learn arbitrary ways of communicating a demand. If they want a banana, if they want a drink, if they want to be chased, if they want to be tickled, they can demand it. And human infants can too. And I and other psychologists incorrectly interpreted those demands as words. But they're not what psychologists refer to as declarative statements, where they're just trying to tell you something. They're speaking not as a speaker to a listener, but just making a demand. It's as if they can go over to a vending machine and push a button and get the reward, and it would be the same effect.
Right. It's more like a demand from reality instead of like a negotiation effected
Right.
through conversation, kind of.
Right.
Maybe like that might be, because it's so tricky, you know, framing another form of communication in our form of communication.
Well, we're so anthropomorphic, and
Right.
understandably so, that it's second nature to superimpose different meanings onto these different communicative acts. But it turns
Right.
out that you can cleanly separate what's a demand from what's a declaration, what's a communication of information.
Right. I have one last question, Professor. I'm curious, and I don't know if we touched upon this the first time we ran a podcast, but there is also a mystery surrounding what makes rhythm, be that in dancing or in music. What is this? What are the bunch of things that are happening, you know, for dancing or music to evolve, right? Is there any speculation to the effect of the rhythm of music is similar to the universal grammar kind of a thing? Like, is there something about that?
It's a wonderful question, and I could probably talk for hours about it.
I mean, I'm fine with that.
The first thing I'll say, and I'm not the first person to think this, is that it's a funny coincidence that we're not only the only species that have language, but we're the only species that have music. And there's probably some relation, but all attempts to find the grammar of music have failed. However, there is one psychologist named Merlin Donald who pointed out that a step towards language was what he called mimesis. And that is movements of the whole body in synchrony with movements of another body.
Like an army.
Like the Rockettes. They're all dancing, you know, rhythmically in step.
Right.
And it certainly grounds for speculating that our ancestors did that and moved around rhythmically. And from those rhythms, perhaps music evolved. And we know that the relation between an infant and a mother are rhythmically connected. In other words, if you look at the utterances in whimpers and cries of a baby to a mother's comments, these have what psychologists call a proto-conversational
nature
quality, that they take turns. So, and there's a rhythm to those, you know, as one speeds up, the other speeds up. As one slows down, the other slows down.
Interesting. That is so interesting.
Well, these are just observations. I mean, there's a lot to work out, but as I say, it's not just a coincidence that we have music and that we have language.
Interesting. That was a brilliant note for me to stop asking questions. Do you have any questions for me, Professor?
No, I think this is very interesting, thorough conversation.
Right. I think so too. I think we have definitely done a better job. I have done a better job at asking you questions this time. And I am very satisfied with this conversation. Thank you so much for doing this. It is always a pleasure.